many of you will be buying the book as Christmas presents after you hear Jenny. And I know that many of us feel that we keep up and we read and we feel we know what's going on. But those of us who were around in 1975 saying, I don't know how this happened, this shouldn't be. It's good that we're still here all those years later to say, well, we knew, and of course Jenny has considerably elaborated on just what the story was. Okay, I'll now formally introduce Professor Jenny Hocking. I always feel that with many people you're introducing, you really don't need to, because her work, the work she's done in chronicling the life of Whitlam is well known, and she's been a prominent historian and academic for many years. But of course she has shot to fame, or maybe, certain people in the archives might say infamy. She refused to accept that material, the letters and other material, was just not available from the Australian archives. And as an historian and an academic relying on such sources, she just said, what can this be? I can't accept that I can't access information that's not just vital to her work, but it's vital that all Australians should know. It's our history, it's what happened to us and our government. It should be known. So she challenged the Australian archives. And the Australian archives had never been challenged before, certainly not in the High Court. Some people, I'm sure, had muttered about not being able to access certain documents in the past, but this was big time, this was legal. And of course, many of you, like people around Australia, supported Jenny's campaign by helping to the GoFundMe, the crowdfunding campaign to cover the costs. And of course now Jenny Hocking is here to tell us why she wrote the Papas letters. Welcome, Jenny.
Thank you, Margaret, so much for such a lovely warm welcome. And thank you everyone for coming. Wonderful to see so many people here. Please tell me if you can't hear me or if I'm blaring out the sound, if I hear a bit of an echo. Is it too loud?
No, it's good.
Excellent. Well, this is the book that Margaret mentioned, the Palace Letters, the Queen, the Governor General, and the Plot to Dismiss Scott Whitlam. Came out in 2022, has been described as a political thriller, and that's certainly the way in which I tried to write the book, because in many ways that book and the process of trying to uncover what really happened with the dismissal has been something of a political thriller, a disgraceful one in many ways. So it's a combination of several things. It's both my journey through the archives as a sort of research journey, it's a courtroom drama, and it's also an unravelling of the dismissal over many years in terms of what really happened. So I hope you get to buy it if you haven't already, and that you enjoy it. It was shortlisted for several awards, which I'm very proud of, and it was also formed the basis for an ABC documentary you might have seen earlier this year called The Search for the Palace Letters, which you can still see on ABC iView. Well, let me get to today's paper. I'll speak for about 40 minutes, and Margaret will probably wind me up after about 40 minutes. And after that, I hope we'll have an extensive time for Q&A. So, I'm always happy to take questions. I find that people are really interested in this topic, and there's always a lot of questions. I'm very happy to take them afterwards. You may have seen last month that we had the first visit of Queen Camilla and King Charles III of Australia, our relatively new monarch and head of state, whom we share with 14 other realms. 5-day royal tour was actually 3 half-days in Sydney and Canberra, in a brief royal stopover on the way to the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Samoa. But one thing that really struck me about that visit is the sharp contrast between the excitement that used to greet Queen Elizabeth when she visited on what were many of her royal tours, and this particular whistle-stop tour of Queen Camilla and King Charles. By comparison, this was a relatively subdued affair, marked largely by disinterest and the occasional curiosity. But if anything, I think the arrival of our new king, newly anointed as a dynastic monarch, an unelected head of state, served to remind us of the jarring contradiction at the heart of a constitutional monarchy, which is also the jarring contradiction at the heart of the dismissal of the Whitlam government. And that is between a monarch and a head of state chosen by birthright alone with extensive powers on the one hand, and the democratic imperative of our parliamentary system on the other. These two things are only able to fit together through what's called the neutrality of the crown. The monarch's representative, do not involve themselves in political matters. And I've long argued that the only way in which that myth, and it is a myth, can continue is by royal secrecy. In other words, we can't know when they are not being politically neutral because we can't access the documents that show that to us. The royal tour was enlivened only by the stunning intervention of independent Senator Lydia Thorpe, who in a remarkable and powerful piece of political prose reminded the king that he headed a dynastic, inherited monarchy in which we had no say, which exists as a relic of colonialism. "You are not my king," she told him. "It's a monarchy that continues to benefit financially, personally and politically from the incursions of a race-based empire. This is not your country," she said, "and whose dispossessions of Indigenous peoples reverberate in a myriad of intergenerational traumas today. Give us what you stole from us, our bones, our skulls, our babies, our people. You destroyed our land. We want a treaty. You are not my king." Now, some people may not agree with me. However, I think those words have a cadence, an urgency, and a poetic and political power to them. And they will, I believe, come to be seen as one of the great political speeches of our time. And I say that all the more so because of their being addressed directly to a sitting monarch, personally. Because otherwise, monarchs and the monarchy are completely shielded from ever having to confront such uncomfortable truths. And this is a literal shielding. One particularly tawdry example of that came during the Queen's 1954 tour, which passed through Shepparton in central Victoria. The royal gaze was spared the sight of the local Yorta people living in appalling conditions in camps and humpies along the riverbed by the erection of Hessian screens. Hessian screens were placed along the train line so she wouldn't have to view this. Yorta elder Auntie Faye Carter later recalled that this was so when the Queen came past the area she wouldn't see all the people camping and ask any questions about what was happening. But what's important for our discussion today about the palace letters and royal secrecy is that the protection of royalty from these unpalatable historical truths about empire and about their own position also works in reverse. Because the other side of that is the shielding of royalty itself from public view and historical scrutiny through the closure of royal documents about their activities. The actions, the finances, the privileges of the royal family are shrouded in secrecy. They're closed to the public under what's termed the Convention of Royal Secrecy. This was a convention I've never heard of until I took a legal action trying to access the palace letters. But through that convention, material to do with the monarchy can only be opened with the express permission of the monarch. In the United Kingdom, all royal correspondence, documents, records of conversations, etc. by the Queen, and now the King, are fiercely guarded in the Royal Archives. So in the UK, you have an ostensibly private archive, the Royal Archive, which is quite separate from the public archive that's located at Kew. Anything that is remotely connected with royalty is plucked out and placed immediately in the Royal Archives and controlled by the monarch's private secretary. The public can only go there with permission, they can only publish with permission, they can only look at material with permission. There is no public catalogue, so you can't even readily see what it is that might be there. You know, it's a bit of taking a large fishing expedition. And there's certainly no right of public access over these documents. Queen Victoria's letters, for example, which are now over a century old, almost all of them still remain closed. And you may have seen Julia Baird talk about the great difficulty she had in accessing any of those letters at all through the Royal Archives. And history is littered with the lapsed research projects of historians and journalists who sought in vain to access the Royal Archives and simply abandoned their projects in the face of repeated denials of access. The historian Alexandra von Tutzelmann wrote recently in a letter in the Times that got quite a bit of publicity that she had given up trying to write about the royal family. And she said, I've decided to focus instead on the history of far more accountable and open organisations like the CIA. And, you know, it sounds extraordinary, but it's certainly the case. The CIA and the MI6 are in fact more open and transparent than the royal family, because they are required to submit regular transfers of documents into the National Archives in the UK each year for cataloguing and availability under certain exemptions, of course. But basically they are part of the Archives Act in the UK, whereas the Queen's documents and the King's documents are not. And that's critically important in this struggle. It's important to note that this routine closure of royal records is not restricted to the Royal Archives in the UK. It extends across the Commonwealth and even into our own National Archive in Canberra. Any documents in our archives relating to the royal family are described as personal and closed to the public. And that was the situation with the palace letters between the Queen and the Governor-General Sir John Kerr, much of which related to Kerr's 1975 dismissal of the Prime Minister Gough Whitlam and his entire government. These letters were in Kerr's papers in the archives and yet closed to the Australian public. And despite being such significant documents in our history, they were under the lock and key in Canberra, where they were embargoed by the Queen. So we couldn't see them, but the Queen, however, if she came over, could have a look at them and could actually remove them if she had wanted to. So, with a bit more detail, what are the palace letters? More specifically, they're letters between the Queen through her private secretary, Sir Martin Charteris, and it's important to know that the private secretary writes as the Queen. There's no question that these are called the Queen's letters. All through the court case, they were referred to as the Queen's correspondence. So the fact that they were written by the private secretary does not mean they're his letters, they are her letters. There are also letters from Prince Charles, from then Prince of Wales, now King Charles, and to and from the Governor-General Sir John Kerr. Much of it, as I said, relating to Kerr's controversial dismissal without warning of Gough Whitlam and his entire government on the 11th of November 1975, nearly exactly 49 years ago this week. The letters were lodged in the National Archives by the official secretary, and this was important, David Smith, in 1978, after Kerr had left office, and they remained closed, as I said, to the Australian public, until, of course, the case that I took in 2020. I'll return to the details of the letters later, but the long struggle to open them highlighted not only the immense barriers to accessing royal archives, but also the great damage that is done to our history by their closure. It means we cannot know the full story of a historical event. The British historian Andrew Loney, who has spent an enormous amount of time and an even more enormous amount of his own money, he has far deeper pockets than me, and he spent close to £250 million fighting against the University of Southampton that had bought Lord Mountbatten's entire archive through public fundraising, promising to make them open and public, bought them and then promptly closed them. for the next 10 years he was engaged in these battles in a process that's been described as eerily similar to the Palace Letters case, in which he won at every point and Southampton would not open them because of royal secrecy. Eventually, he did succeed in opening most of them, but about 5% of them remain closed, and they are the most critical documents in those files around the partition of India, etc. However, Andrew Loney wrote, if our history is to be written accurately, we will have to have all the records made available. To do otherwise is to construct a curated history in which the royal family appears, if at all, entirely on their own terms. And that, of course, is not a history at all. The key problem that Andrew Loney identifies of royal control over archives and therefore over our writing of history continues unabated today. The Queen has left a vast and immensely significant archive collected during what was an exceptionally long reign. This is a priceless historical collection. And King Charles has recently handed the task of the initial culling of this invaluable archive to the Queen's recently retired footman. This is a long-standing palace aide with no training either as a historian or an archivist, and he is now entrusted with this momentous task of deciding which of these irreplaceable royal records should be destroyed or kept secret, or in some tiny, minute number, perhaps made available to the public. Whatever remains after this appalling vandalism of our shared constitutional history will be placed in the Royal Archives, not in the National Public Archives, and they will be placed under a 100-year embargo to be closed until a future monarch grants access, if at all, to selected researchers. And that is the real enormous problematic that historians and others have confronted, and that I confronted with Palace Letters. Just as a quick example about this obsession, as it's been described, the obsession with secrecy, it extended even into Sir John Kerr's published memoirs. The year after he left office in late 1978, his memoir was published that he described as the facts of the matter of 1975. It was called Matters for Judgment. Well, lo and behold, what did I find in his files? But letters with Buckingham Palace showing that they had vetted his memoir. And what they had vetted was to remove any reference to his secret discussions with the Queen's private secretary about the crisis, as they politely called it. So they asked her to remove any indication that he had been in secret conversation with Sir Martin Chartres about the dismissal of the government, which Kerr then duly did. The Queen's private secretary wrote back to him and said how very gratified they were that he had been so scrupulous in omitting any mention of his exchanges with Sir Martin Chartres. It is difficult to imagine a more overt royal whitewash of history than this. And many people still point to Kerr's memoir and say, well, the Queen could not have been engaged with him about this matter because he doesn't mention it. Well, we know now why he doesn't mention it. But as the dismissal passed into history, the dominant historical view was that this was a solo act, that Kerr had acted alone, that he had no further advice from others, that in the words of the veteran journalist Alan Reid, Kerr reached a lonely and agonising decision. And central to this apparently settled history was the view that the palace was not involved in Kerr's decision in any way. And this was emphasised at every point from the day of the dismissal on, that Kerr protected the Queen by maintaining her ignorance of what he was thinking and what he thought he might do. The Queen's then Deputy Private Secretary, Sir William Heseltine, later described it in these words: the palace was in a state of total ignorance, total ignorance. Now, having read the Palace Letters in their entirety and seeing that they first discussed the possibility of dismissing Scott Whitlam in September 1975, I find that expression of total ignorance absolutely staggering. I mean, it's false. It's completely false. And the view that the palace was in total ignorance and in no way involved in Kerr's decision has been the one constant in the history of the dismissal, which has been changing over time up until the letters release. In recent years, we've seen a series of revelations from previously closed archives, and that link between history and archives is very clear in this. because as new material has emerged, the history of the dismissal has had to change with it. Hilary Mantel describes history in the past as being in constant dialogue with each other, and that out of that dynamic, a new history and a new understanding of events of the past emerges. And in that process, historical correction is precisely what's happened with our understanding of the dismissal. But there's no single archival holding that's been more important in that process of really unravelling the dismissal than the papers of Sir John Kerr. This is a vast, really, excuse me, quite enormous holding that's in the National Archive UK. And until I started looking at them, which was around about probably 2007, I think, they had not been opened really, but maybe one or two files had been opened. They'd only just come into the open access period, which was after 30 years. And I was working on Whitlam's biography, and I started to look through Kerr's papers. And what I found there was absolutely astonishing. The most important document was, without doubt, Kerr's 12-page account of his secret meetings, discussions and planning with the then High Court Justice, the sitting High Court Justice, Sir Anthony Mason, in the months leading up to the dismissal, which I then published in the second volume of my book about Whitlam, A Moment in History. For 37 years, Mason's role had been kept secret from the Prime Minister, Whitlam, from his fellow High Court Justices, and from the Australian public. They met over many months. They discussed Kerr's powers. Mason arranged special meetings with senior academics at the ANU Law School, where he was a provost. He even drafted a letter of dismissal for Sir John Kerr. So this was not merely a role of guidance, nor, as Kerr described it in his papers, of fortification. It was an active involvement by a sitting High Court Justice in the removal of the Prime Minister and the government. The only tenable conclusion, according to the Australian when this was revealed, is that Mason was implicated in Kerr's dismissal of Whitlam, and yet his name, until this came out, had been seen as a very minor one, if relevant at all. Garfield Barwick, the Chief Justice, had always been seen as the person most involved legally in Kerr's decision. Mason then put out his own statement, the only statement he has ever made about this, in which he confirmed his involvement, and he's refused to comment, as I said, since. Now, I had actually interviewed Mason when I was working on the biography, and it was very interesting. I probably don't have time to go into much detail, but I interviewed him twice. The first time I hadn't found this document, the second time I had. You could say it was a very interesting conversation. And I did ask him, and this has been quoted many, many times because it's such an appalling comment from him. I knew this time that he had huge involvement with Kerr, possibly a definitive one, and I asked him very carefully, would you speak on the record publicly now about what happened in 1975? And I said, in the interest of history, you're probably one of only two people still alive who can speak further on it. And he looked at me for a while and then he said, I owe history nothing. And I can tell you I was pretty unimpressed with that response. He had been a public figure, paid for publicly for much of his professional life, and a highly respected one. And to think that he himself sought to keep his role secret because Kerr had pleaded with him to make it public. He thought it would support his decision if it was known that Mason had this role. And Mason said he didn't want anyone to know his role until after he died. It was an appalling example, I think, of moral cowardice. But the discovery of that single file, I knew as soon as I saw it, would change how we saw the dismissal irrevocably. It was seen as, quote, a discovery of historical importance, and it certainly drove a reconsideration of the dismissal. The established dismissal narrative of this as a solo action by Kerr, which I have to say many people have thought was simply not possible, it's not a tenable argument, that he had neither conceived consulted with nor revealed his intentions to others is completely, we now know, wrong. And it had shifted overnight to a version of history involving collusion, deception and duplicity. But it's the quintessential example, really, of the way in which public access to archives will change history, change the written history. It can't change what happened, but it can change what we know about what happened. And there's no better example, or perhaps worse example, than the Mason material until we came to the Palace letters. And they have now been fundamental, just as the Mason material was, fundamental to that ongoing process of historical corrective. I tried to open them for more than a decade by requesting access to them in the archives, and each time I was told very firmly that they were personal, that they were covered by Kerr's own wishes, which was that they not be opened until well after 2027, and only then with the Queen's Private Secretary's permission. So although we knew that the letters existed, we knew they were in the archives, we knew very little else about them. I didn't even know how many letters there were, how many pages there were, how often they wrote, or what they discussed. All we knew was that they were in the archives and we couldn't see them. So when I commenced proceedings, as I said, I didn't know how many letters there actually were. There'd been enough written about what were called the Governor-General's dispatches, which are his official communications, his or her official communications with the Queen, with the monarch, to know that most of them were written quarterly, some less, maybe some more. So I had a rough idea in my head that there might be, say there was 5 or 6 a year from Kerr, maybe similar number from Charters, there might have been only 4. But since Kerr was only in office for 3.5 years, I thought, well, that's going to be 4 one way, 4, so let's say 10 a year. So there might be 30 or 40 at the absolute most. Well, soon after the case started, and with legal things were so fascinating for me, I knew nothing about the entrails of a legal case, but it was so interesting to get back letters from the government lawyers, etc. And for some reason, very early on, when we were actually negotiating which parts of material would be public in terms of the thing called agreed facts, which would be the agreed facts. For some reason, but I do not know why, I got back a letter from the government solicitor and I turned on the track change. And the track change was still on. And what had been deleted was a note saying how many letters there were.
Oh.
And you can imagine my absolute shock to see that it said 212 letters.
Oh.
Forget the 40 letters that I thought would be lucky to get. There were over 200 letters between Charters and Kerr. And I remember just being absolutely flabbergasted, and I wrote quickly to my lawyers and said, this was in the track change when I turned it on. Do you think I can use it? And they said, well, they put it in a document that they sent to you. You can use it. They didn't say there's a particular legal wording they have put at the beginning, which I think it's without prejudice, and they hadn't put that on this letter. Anyway, so I then wrote an article about the 212 letters. So I was enjoying this part of the process very much. So the letters cover the entirety of Kerr's term in office, mid-1974 to December 77. There are more than 1,200 pages in total because of all the attachments. It was absolutely obsessive. At times he wrote several letters in a single day. You can imagine how they must have been received in England. Oh my God, this is another letter. So some of the letters have got, Dear Sir Martin, there's a great big long letter, and then the next day, look, I thought I'd just add this because I've been writing, and then later that one. The day his first wife died, he sent 2 letters to go to Buckingham Palace. It's quite, it's very disturbing to read them, I have to say. I'll come back to that later. But he included, these voluminous attachments backing up hundreds of pages. It's an extraordinary number of viceregal letters or dispatches, which are usually sent every 6 months, as I said, or at most quarterly. Just as a point of comparison, because these other Governors-General's letters were also released as a result of a court case, Kerr's letters comprise as many pages in 3.5 years as the letters of 4 other Governors-General put together. So, it's a really extensive and quite irregular set of correspondence. Why are they important? Well, the single most obvious reason for their importance is that they cover matters relating to Kerr's dismissal of the Whitlam government. From September 1975, when Kerr first raises that possibility, he mentions it to Charteris. The letters then canvass issues which are central to his decision to dismiss the government, including, of course, the potential use of the reserve powers. And all of it is secret from the Prime Minister and elected government, who are his formal Australian advisors. Kerr's dismissal of an elected government, which, remember, retained the confidence of the House of Representatives at all times, was an unprecedented and contentious use of the reserve powers, and debate about that continues today. And in place of the Whitlam government, which had been re-elected just 18 months earlier in the May 1974 election, Kerr appointed as Prime Minister the Liberal Party leader Malcolm Fraser, whose party had lost the previous two electors, who did not have the confidence of the House of Representatives. And I'm not going to recap the entire history of the dismissal, thankfully, in this limited time, but I do want to make a couple of points that I think are really important to keep in mind as we talk about the letters, which we will do so shortly. Firstly, Whitlam was in the process of calling a half Senate election when he was dismissed. And that's really important to remember. Kerr always claimed that Whitlam was refusing to call an election. He was in the process of calling an election. And the half Senate election is actually set in terms of its timing by the Constitution. It was due at that time. And Kerr always knew that that was going to be the end point for the government if supply was blocked. Whitlam arrived at Government House at 1 p.m. by arrangement with Kerr himself. And the arrangement was to sign off on the agreement he had reached with Kerr. This is where the deception is at its most terrific. The agreement he had already reached with Kerr to call the half Senate election. It didn't need Kerr's agreement, it's a constitutional requirement. But they'd agreed on the wording of the statement that Whitlam was to read out that afternoon in the House of Representatives announcing the half Senate election, which was to be held on December the 13th, which is, of course, when the election was finally held. And that wording had been agreed in the morning. The letter had been written, prepared for Whitlam by his staff while he was in Parliament. He picked up the letter after Parliament rose for lunch, went out to Yarralumla and was about to hand it to the Governor-General when the Governor-General put his hand up and said, "I have a letter of my own." And face down on his desk was a letter that was already typed, that was already signed, dismissing Gough Whitlam and his entire ministry. There was no warning, no discussion. And Gough Whitlam later described this to me as the greatest shock I had ever experienced. And of course the backdrop to this is that supply had been not rejected but blocked in the Senate for the previous 4 weeks. It had been put forward by the government 3 times. 3 times the Senate had refused to vote on it. It repeatedly sent it back to the House of Representatives with an addition saying, "We will not consider this bill." In other words, we're refusing to vote on it until you agree to submit, the wording was submit, till the government agrees to submit itself to the judgment of the people. Didn't actually specify a House of Representatives election, and that's important. It simply said submit itself to the judgment of the people before it would agree to vote on it. As Whitlam said, the Senate was blackmailing the government over supply. So, one of the interesting archival finds is that if you, if in the archives, I think now with the Whitlam Institute, is Whitlam's letter to Kerr that he was handing Kerr when he went out to Government House, which was to call the House Senate election. And there's a handwritten notation up in the right-hand corner from DS, David Smith. The recommendation was not made, underlined, because it's very important for Kerr to believe that the Prime Minister had never actually asked for the House Senate election, which of course is a furphy. But a final point on this, and it's often forgotten, is that both the House of Representatives and the Senate continued to sit an hour later. We often remember the Senate sat and the Senate passed supply, but the House of Representatives reconvened as well. Whitlam at this point did not know that Kerr had appointed Fraser. He knew he'd been dismissed, but he didn't know that Fraser had been waiting secretly in the ante-room in Yarralumla as he was being dismissed, and as soon soon as Whitlam disappeared down one end of the corridor, Fraser emerged from the other and went in and was signed in as Prime Minister. Whitlam did not know that, and that's important. And so the House resumed at 2 p.m. Kerr's appointed Prime Minister, Liberal leader Malcolm Fraser, then lost once he announced, "I am already Prime Minister," about 3/4 of an hour later, at which point the House of Representatives erupted into total uproar. A motion of no confidence was then passed in Fraser and in the Fraser government. That same motion from the House of Representatives called on the Governor-General to commission a government led by the member for Werriwa, that is Scott Whitlam. So in other words, the Parliament had done what it should do. Supply had been passed by the Senate. The House of Representatives had voted its confidence by 10 votes in a government led by Scott Whitlam. The Speaker of the House was then dispatched to go to Government House and convey the wishes of the House to the Governor-General. The Governor-General refused to see him. So, in an extraordinary series of events in which political conventions were torn up like confetti, Fraser refused to resign, Kerr refused to receive the Speaker or even to acknowledge the motion of the House. We do know, thanks to the material about Sir Anthony Mason and Sir Anthony Mason's own statement, that Kerr then rang him, and this is where Mason's role becomes absolutely central to the dismissal. Kerr rang him and said, effectively, what am I going to do? You know, Whitlam has supply, he has confidence. And Mason said to him, again, stark words, the motion of the House, that is the all-important motion of confidence or otherwise in a government, is irrelevant. In other words, stick with what you're doing and ignore the House. I call this, because Kerr then dissolved both Houses of Parliament when they had a live motion of no confidence before, with Fraser still in office. I call this Kerr's second dismissal, because it was the dismissal of the Parliament itself. He overrode the Parliament. And in many ways that's a more damning dismissal, I think, than the dismissal of the government, because it placed into office and went to the election in office with someone who explicitly did not have the confidence of the House. In a letter to the Speaker of the House, Gordon Scholes, who had written immediately or within a day or two to the Queen to point out this appalling situation in relation to the choice of government being an autocratic decision of the Governor-General and neither of the mandate of the people through the previous election nor of the House, the Queen's Private Secretary, Sir Martin Charteris, wrote to Scholes the week after the dismissal, insisting that the Queen was not involved in Kerr's decision, and this is where they cemented this view. Quote, "The Queen has no part in the decisions which the Governor-General must take in accordance with the Constitution. It would not be proper for her to intervene in person in matters which are so clearly placed within the jurisdiction of the Governor-General." Never, of course, revealing she had actually been in correspondence with him about those powers for 2 months before the dismissal. The release of the Palace letters comprehensively demolished this view, after which, according to the Monthly, no respectable historian could accept that the Queen played no role in Kerr's decision to dismiss Whitlam. As Professor Frank Bongiorno has also noted, the Queen was indeed a player. So, given that undoubted significance of the Palace letters, why did the Archives refuse to release them? Why did it take a High Court action for the Archives to release letters which are fundamental to our understanding of the dismissal of the Whitlam government? The answer is a single word, and that word is personal. Now, personal, as I now know only too well, is uniquely powerful, because that takes any letters that are seen as personal out of the reach of the Archives Act and places them under what's called an instrument of deposit of the person who deposited the letters, and that is, or I was told, that was Kerr. Well, again, that was untrue. During a court case, we asked to see Kerr's so-called instrument of deposit, only to find that his instrument of deposit had actually been superseded by no one other than the Queen. Within weeks of Kerr's death, the Queen's private secretary instructed the Archives, and it was called the Instructions of the Queen, to close the records until at least 2027, and then they could only be opened with the approval of both the Governor-General's official secretary and the Queen's private secretary, which gave the Queen's private secretary a lasting veto over the release of the letters. all of this was central to our legal action. I just want to say quickly, I'll move on, or I won't get to what my letters are actually about. The reason why we could mount a case, because as you can imagine, mounting a legal action about secret documents is next to impossible, because how can you say that you need to see these documents if you can't actually see them? You don't even know what it is you're saying is important and needs to be seen. However, there was a key difference in this, and that was that I had found a lot of material about the letters in Kerr's papers. I'd even found extracts from about 6 or 7 of the letters. I'd found Kerr's handwritten journal from 1980 where he'd set out his conversations with Charles and Charles and others about the dismissal, letters to other people, notes about these discussions, etc. And a handwritten reference in his papers to Sir Martin Charteris's advice to me on dismissal. So we put all of these things together because they show very clearly that these letters were not personal. They were part of Kerr's official considerations as Governor-General. And so there's a unique confluence of factors. On the one hand, we had all that research to say these letters are not personal. We've got some evidence here to show that. But we also had a unique confluence of a group of remarkable lawyers, pro bono lawyers, who agreed to take this case for me on a pro bono basis. And that was Brett Walker, SC, Tom Brennan, SC, and Anthony Whitlam, QC, and of course Chambers Rescott. And the case just would never have gone ahead without them, because I didn't have the wherewithal or the capacity to fund it myself. So we owe them a great debt of gratitude. But for me, the case was always about history, because I believe all history should be public history, and we have a right to know our own history, and we can't know it if we can't access it. So in 2015, I took a deep breath and commenced action in the Federal Court of Australia against the National Archives, seeking the release of the Palace letters. So all of those documents I found, Kerr's notes, pages from his journal, the 6 extracts of Palace letters, and other materials, they became, 2 chapters from my book, The Dismissal Dossier, Everything You Were Never Meant to Know, about November 1975, a previous book. 2 of those chapters, they all became part of what is called the evidence book, which was a pretty daunting thing, because the evidence book ended up with the High Court of Australia. But one of the things we had to do, of course, was Kerr's handwriting is so difficult to follow in his journal. And I could be rude and say this was particularly the case after lunch, where it would sort of end up almost falling off the page. But there were many times when the lawyer said, look, we can't just have these photocopies of pages from his journal. We're going to have to get somebody to actually transcribe them into type. And I'd be rang up at endless times saying, what does this say? But I'd come to read his handwriting very clearly, which was a bit alarming. But Buckingham Palace took a really keen interest from the outset, and I was I never stopped being astonished by this whole process and quite fascinated by it. And I thought I was very, very, privileged to have this opportunity to pour through historical documents in a legal setting, and I'm so grateful both for the outcome but also for the experience. The archives solicitors who were right at the top, the Australian Solicitor General, Donahue, they put together material from the Palace saying that these letters should not be released, and that their continued secrecy was essential, quote, to preserve the constitutional position of the monarch and the monarchy, and to protect the dignity of the Queen. Now, I was very surprised by this, because who knew that an academic's fairly routine research request to access historical letters in our own archives could be so undermining as to threaten the constitutional position of the monarchy. It does show, I think, the great fear that the monarchy has of losing control that they had exercised through royal secrecy. Because central to the case came this Convention of Royal Secrecy, which we argue did not, in fact, exist. Very important. So, by the time we got to the High Court, we had the Commonwealth Solicitor General Stephen Donahue, QC, leading the archives team. The Federal Attorney General, Christian Porter, had joined with the archives in contesting the case against me. So you could say we faced really formidable barriers to accessing the the palace letters. The case did not succeed at the federal court. We appealed, and it was very disappointing in a 2-1 decision that we did not succeed at the appeal before we finally gained special leave to appeal to the High Court. And that was a wonderful moment, because that's when I knew we would actually end up in the High Court. And in May 2020, after a 4.5 years legal battle, the High Court of Australia emphatically determined in a 6-1 decision that the palace letters were not personal, that they're subject to the Archives Act as Commonwealth record, and starkly rejected the claim that the letters were in any way personal. And interestingly, the High Court also specifically rejected any notion of a convention of royal secrecy, and several of the judges referred to the evidence for this so-called convention as extremely thin. And that's a really significant part which carries weight in other jurisdictions, that this so-called convention has now been successfully challenged. The National Archives' decision to contest the case was immensely costly for it, both financially and reputationally, because the High Court also issued 3 cost orders against it, ordering the Archives to pay my costs all the way back to the Federal Court action. Federal Court, the appeal, and the High Court action, close to $2 million spent by the National Archives when it was saying it had insufficient resources to protect its own records, to try and stop the Australian people seeing these all-important letters. It was a low point, I think, in the Archives' decision-making. They were finally released in full in July 2020, in what was a great victory for our history and for transparency. So what do they say? And have I got 10 minutes still to go through this? The first thing you'll notice is Kerr's tone. It's overweening deference and need for royal approbation. It's humiliating to read. The former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, in a really excellent foreword to this book, describes Kerr's sycophantic grovelling as stomach churning. And I have to say it is. I mean, he'd been previously Chief Justice of the New South Wales Supreme Court, and here he is asking Sir Martin Sharper, should I wear a morning suit or a lounge suit to my swearing in? I mean, it's just, there was no matter too petty for Kerr to seek royal approval. It's quite stark. Turnbull writes that he had expected Charters would reply to Kerr with little more than a sort of acknowledgement, but in fact they conferred on the political and constitutional circumstances in considerable detail, and that of course is the problem. I'll just skip through to the letters showing that they first discussed the possible dismissal of the government in September, 2 months before the dismissal. It's here that the political dimension of the letters is laid bare, and that far from remaining politically neutral as the royal family claims it does, and indeed the requirement of a constitutional monarchy is, as I said, that they remain at all times politically neutral. It's difficult to imagine a greater level of political involvement than this. The major discussion of the possible dismissal of the government began in September, as I said, weeks before supply was even blocked in the Senate. And this is relaying a conversation that Kerr had with Prince Charles in Port Moresby during the PNG Independence Day celebrations. And it's a sort of Shakespearean tableau with every one of the protagonists there at Gough Whitlam's invitation, because his government had ensured, as it had promised, independence for PNG within 3 years. So Sir Guthrie Barr is there, Nathan Fraser is there, Kerr is there, Prince Charles is there representing the Queen, and Kerr then writes in his journal, which is where I first found a mention to it, that he discussed with Charles that he may need to dismiss the government if the government refuses to resign and if supply is blocked. So there's a series of ifs. And he put it to Charles that he feared that Whitlam might seek to dismiss in turn Kerr from office if he realised that this was the path he was going down. So there's no question that Charles was aware of that possibility. The question was, did the Queen know of it? Well, this was the first letter I looked for, was a letter that Kerr had referred to in his journal, indicating that that conversation had been conveyed to Buckingham Palace, the Queen and Charters, and that Charters had then written to Kerr about it. And sure enough, that letter is there, a letter from the 2nd of October 1975. And in that letter, Charteris tells Kerr that his conversation with Charles in Port Moresby, where, remember, he raised the possible use of the reserve powers, he raised his concerns about needing to dismiss the governor, had been discussed by the Queen and Charteris. They had considered and then discussed how the Queen would deal with any such matter if it came to her, if Whitlam did indeed seek to recall Kerr, advice which the Prime Minister, by the way, would have been perfectly entitled to give, particularly if he found out his Governor-General had been conspiring against him, but which he never did. But nevertheless, they were then part of Kerr's thinking. To quote Turnbull again, this advice from the Queen's Private Secretary no doubt reinforced Kerr in concluding that to forestall any risk of Whitlam sacking him, he would need to give him very little or no warning of his intention. And it's this letter and those that follow that most closely link the palace to Kerr's deception of Whitlam and his failure to warn him. These are letters which quite simply should never have been written. Charteris should have maintained the strict political neutrality of the Crown, to which Buckingham Palace claims the monarch adheres at all times. So if we fast forward to October 75, supply has now been locked in a Senate for nearly a week. Whitlam asked the Solicitor General Sir Maurice Byers and the Attorney General Kerr, who are the formal legal advisors to the Governor General, they're the Australian legal advisors he takes his advice from, to prepare an opinion for Kerr on just this question of the reserve powers and whether they are applicable in the current situation in which supply is still before the Parliament but has not yet been passed. The following day, while that legal advice is being prepared for him, Kerr writes to Charteris and tells him the entire box of dice and says he expects the law officers, that is the Solicitor General and the Attorney General, to advise him that the reserve powers either do not exist or at least that if they do exist, and this was a big question at that time, that they do not apply to the current political situation in Australia. In other words, there's no call for you to use the reserve power. And in fact, that's exactly what they do advise him. I think about 2 weeks later, 10 days later. But this is an all-important letter of the 22nd of October. It's one of the most important ones from Kerr, because he is letting Charteris, and therefore the Queen, know that he may not accept the formal advice that he is required to follow as the Governor-General from both the Prime Minister and the formal legal advisors, that is, the first and second law officers of our land. He told Charteris it does not follow that in an extreme constitutional crisis I would accept that advice. Whitlam doesn't know that, but the Queen knows that. That he was prepared to act against the advice of the Prime Minister and the Commonwealth law officers on the question of the reserve powers before he has even received that advice. He hasn't yet received the advice. Yet at no stage did Charteris express any concern that the Governor-General is contemplating such a breach of the cardinal principle of constitutional monarchy, nor remind her of his fundamental duty to speak to the Prime Minister. Well, the law officer's opinion came in on the 6th of November 1975, 5 days before the dismissal, and it of course did advise Kerr that, quote, the mere threat of, or indeed the actual rejection of supply, neither calls for the Ministry to resign, nor compels the Crown's representative, that is the Governor-General, to intervene, because it was still a live political issue. Let's move to Charteris's final 2 letters before the dismissal. In my mind, they are the most egregious and overtly political. On the 4th of November, Charteris, and we have to remember that Charteris has no legal training whatsoever. He's not even a British lawyer, let alone an Australian one. That's why we have the Solicitor General and the Attorney General. But Charteris assures Kerr that the reserve powers do exist. He writes, those powers do exist. That you have powers is recognised. Well, we might ask, by whom is it recognised? It was not recognised by the Prime Minister, the Attorney General, or the Solicitor General, on whose advice to Kerr on this very point was in direct contradiction to Charteris's bald and unsupported assertion. And in his letter of the 5th of November, his final letter before the dismissal, Charteris assuages a concern that Kerr had raised in an earlier letter that week about the impact that using the reserve powers might have on the position of the monarchy in Australia. Kerr is concerned that if he used the reserve powers, it might harm the monarchy in Australia. Charteris writes back to Kerr and says, if you do, as you will, what the Constitution dictates. You cannot possibly do the monarchy any avoidable harm. The chances are you will do it good. Chances are you will do it good. That's the final letter before Kerr dismisses the government. And it's precisely why Malcolm Turnbull concludes that Charteris's letters can be read as encouraging Kerr to dismiss Whitlam. Yet within hours of the letter's release, in 2020, Buckingham Palace issued a rare public statement, again asserting that the palace letters confirm that neither Her Majesty nor the royal household had any part to play in Kerr's decision to dismiss him. You know, it's as if we're on two parallel universes here. And so they simply continued to claim that despite the months of discussion between Kerr and the Queen, Charles and Prince Charles, about matters at the very heart of the dismissal, it played no part in Kerr's decision to dismiss. Let me just wind up now and point out again that the release of the letters, the overturning of the claim to prevent the royal secrecy, has been a landmark decision of our High Court, and it's necessitated a significant recalibration of the history of the dismissal. And at the same time, the release has highlighted how very damaging it is to history to fail to open such significant archives to public view. And those archives are essential, we now know, I think beyond any doubt, if we're to write a complete and accurate history of the dismissal of the Whitlam government. And so, let me just end by saying it's shocking to see that even today, hundreds and hundreds of files in Kerr's papers remain closed, 50 years after the events they describe, and this is profoundly wrong. And in my view, the Minister responsible, Tony Burke, should take the opportunity that the 50th anniversary next year gives us to simply say all relevant documents on the dismissal should now be open to us and to the verdict of history. A couple of things you might want to take up in questions, and I hope that you can all state a question, that I also uncovered a lot of missing files and destroyed files and strangely absent files. Let me give you just three, some of you might like to follow it up. Got Whitlam's ASIO file, which I stumbled across quite unexpectedly, dating back to the 1960s, mysteriously apparently destroyed within weeks of me asking for it. The Government House guest books, which exist in totality except for 1974 and 1975. The Government House doesn't know where they are, and the archives don't know where they are. They've simply disappeared. And then a box of letters from prominent people supporting Kerr's action in removing the government. Again, mysteriously and accidentally burnt in the Yarrawonga incinerator. And so I think we have a lot of problems with archival access and a lot of work to do in making the archives a truly pro-disclosure organisation as it claims to be. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Very simple. That was brilliant. When are you going to publish it and where?
Well, most of it is published in here. The Palace Letters, as I said, published by Scribe. Look, I have been working on another book which would really be to try and bring everything we know now together into one single story about the dismissal. But I've been enormously frustrated by the archives. I didn't go into another very boring bureaucratic element of archives access that the Morrison government instituted, which is to put a cap of just 25 requests. And I've been blocked from asking for any new documents for 18 months. When I'd been telling them for 18 months this was incorrect, that they'd incorrectly calculated. And after 18 months they wrote to me and said, oh yes, you're quite right, you have incorrectly calculated it. Well, I've wasted 18 months arguing. It's appalling. I mean, I can't express too strongly how much the archives needs a root and ground to clean out, and a minister that is going to take that quite seriously. So it's a frustrating answer to your question that I like many other research projects, have got nowhere. I'm not prepared to write another book that hasn't been able to bring out the other material that I know is there. But the most up-to-date part of my journey, if you like, is in the Palace Letters. It's it's done very well. It's as I said, it's become a film as well. So I don't have a lot of other material from that, but whatever I have, I've been publishing as articles along the way. Particularly in a wonderful online publication called Pearls and Irritations, which is great. Yeah, so do have a look at that.
Any other questions? Yes.
To follow up, do you think the time's come for a new look at political morality?
I think there's certainly, I mean, we've got a lot more constraints around what sorts of things have to be divulged, etc. I don't have a problem with that so much as the fact that the transparency options that are available through the Freedom of Information Act and the Archives Act are not being adhered to properly. And that, I think, is a huge problem. Both those acts came out of a notion of open government, full of promise from the Whitlam government's open government series of developments, and yet they haven't lived up to their promise in recent years. So I think we do need to relook at how both FOI and the Archives Act are processing claims before them, and that would, I think, alleviate a lot of the problems that historians have with closed records. I think there was another question just here. Yeah. Yes.
Bit nervous asking actually.
No.
At the time I was...
There's an all here.
Okay. At the time I was a fairly young person with the dismissal, but it never occurred to me, it didn't seem to me that there was ever an answer as to the motivations behind the dismissal. And I may have missed things with my head in the clouds ever since, but has anyone come up with the possible reasons behind why there would have been such a brazen act without ever being disclosed? I mean, could it be, it wouldn't have just been Kerr's imagination, he must have had some reason for wanting to instigate it.
Look, fundamentally, and I'll probably talk more about this in the biography of Whitlam, which is now 10 years old, more than that, 13 years old. I think it's very much to do with a couple of things. The first is that Whitlam had come in as the first Labor government in 23 years. That's really critical. There was, it's very difficult for us to imagine the upheaval that caused in the sort of political structures that had been set up in the post-war period, which had been almost entirely under Menzies. And so you still had this very Menzian view of how things were done, how governments behaved, the nexus between here and the UK, for example, was incredibly strong. So Alexander Downer's father was the High Commissioner and was, extremely conservative and totally embedded in, the British upper ruling class, etc., and the Conservative Party. And so this was a huge shake-up for them. Whitlam started removing the privileges that British nationals had in coming to Australia. As you would know, ended the White Australia policy, which meant also that the privileges that the British people got in emigrating here, they had a shorter period of time before they could claim citizenship, etc., were removed, and they were furious about that. But fundamentally, it's an internal political push from the opposition, and it was determined from the outset. The leader of the Liberal Party in the Senate, Reg Withers, said just weeks after the first election of the Whitlam government that the opposition, the coalition, would use its numbers in the Senate to bring down the Whitlam government. And they were very clear about that. They made no secret of it. They tried in 1974 when, because of the actions of a good Governor-General and a proper Governor-General who was Sir Paul Hasluck, and this in my view is not looked at closely enough because it was the real, if you like, the precedent for how Kerr should have behaved in 1975, is that the opposition tried exactly the same thing. They threatened to block supply, but Hasluck dealt with it properly. He spoke to Whitlam, he discussed with Whitlam that Whitlam wanted to call an election, but he wanted a double resolution at that point. He didn't want one the following year. And so he and Hasler together worked out the wording of the statement. In other words, Hasler agreed to the provisional granting of that election pending the passage of supply. Whitlam went back to the House and told them that, the Senate, etc., at which point they passed supply. That is precisely what Kerr should have done. Granted Whitlam the House Senate election conditional on supply being passed, it would have put the onus back on the Senate. And I have no doubt the Senate would at that point have passed supply, because Misson and others had already said that they were going to pass supply when it came back up again. So it's an internal Australian domestic political issue of a really unprincipled opposition. I don't think there's any doubt about that. You know, Fraser is the only Prime Minister to have refused to resign when he lost the motion of confidence in the House. It's unheard of. And, you know, I think his legacy is deeply stained by that. But Kerr would not have done it if he felt that the royal family would at any point publicly decided what he had done. If you look at the way he operated, which is very, very evident through his papers, through Mason and Barwick, he believed enough of the High Court on the side to say, well, I've got High Court advice. He had that, he had the opposition, of course, and he also had the Queen and Prince Charles supporting him. Prince Charles, after the dismissal, wrote to Kerr and said what you did was the right and courageous thing to do. This is our current king. He should have been asked about that and about his role during his visit. It would have been a much more interesting visit if he had.
Thank you very much, Professor Hocking. It's been a wonderful insight into that whole fight to get the Palace letters released, or some of them released.
There's about 10 missing apparently.
Yes. It's been wonderful to have you here. Thank you very much for being here, and anyone who's interested can also come along to Fuller's tonight at 5:30 when Henry Reynolds will be in conversation with Jenny Hocking. And just before we leave, could you just indicate if you can really remember the moment you heard that Whitlam had been so upset? Yeah. So it's obviously had a major impact. I mean, I think the only other thing that I remember at the time was when Kennedy was shot. And many people of my generation can remember that's where they were and what was happening. And certainly I think the sacking of Whitlam is something that many of our generation and a bit younger also remember if they were in Australia at the time. So thank you very much, Jennifer.